Hello, everyone. This is your host, Andrew Pledger, and I am a survivor of Bob Jones University. And this is Beyond BJU Exposing Fundamentalism, which is a podcast that sheds light on Christian fundamentalism in the context of Bob Jones University. The show includes survivor stories from BJU and also Bob Jones affiliated ministries like Christian day schools, camps, and churches. The podcast also explores BJU's influence beyond the school and its impact on American society. I want to thank my Patreon supporters who allow me to do this work, and if you could join my Patreon, it would be greatly appreciated. The link is in the description of every episode. But if you feel that you can't do that, then I would appreciate it if you would leave a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, because this helps other listeners like you discover the show. Thank you. Hello, everyone. This is your host, Andrew Pledger, and this is Beyond BJU. I am really looking forward to you hearing this episode. I have on today Sheila Clark. Sheila, how are you doing?
Well, how about you?
I am doing good. For people who are not familiar with you, could you introduce yourself?
I'm Sheila Clark. I live in the upstate of South Carolina with my husband and 4 children. I was raised in New York State, where my family joined an independent Baptist church connected with Bob Jones University. The pastor there targeted my family right away. We were a large family. My father didn't come to church. My father was a Scientologist. It was a vulnerability that the pastor exploited. He targeted my family for abuse, and mine began at age 15. I wound up at Bob Jones University when I was 19, really seeking refuge there, and that did not work out well for me. My abuse continued, and then I was expelled from Bob Jones University when they found out about my abuse. So that's what kind of led me into being a participant in the Grace Report.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that introduction and sharing a bit about that pastor. And I was surprised when you said your dad was in Scientology. That is just really shocking to me because, wow, 2 different cults, that's a lot. If you could, whatever you're comfortable sharing, if you could summarize your involvement with the Grace Report and how that came about.
Yeah, so I didn't know anything about the Grace Report when it was first initiated. I heard about it when it was terminated, actually. I guess that uproar on social media made its way to me. And when it was reinstated, I reached out to the team and asked if they were still doing interviews, and they were. And so they asked me to come out. I didn't go intending to help with the investigation. Through hearing about the Grace investigation, I learned about Anderson and I heard her story. That was the first time I realized that I wasn't the only one. I didn't understand what happened to me as abuse. And I went to be interviewed by that team with the hope that maybe they could explain to me what happened to me. I had been very quiet about what I experienced ever since 2005. It was just oozing. I thought I was keeping it contained, but it was just oozing out all over my life and causing lots of problems for me. So I thought that if I could survive talking about it, I would get it out of my system and put the lid back on and keep trucking. I didn't quite go that way. I had that interview and they gave me language for what happened, which was really helpful, but dumping all of that on them was maybe not the best way to go about it for myself. I cried for 2 weeks after that, and they sent me my interview transcript, and I was supposed to edit it, and I couldn't even look at it. I didn't tell anybody that I had been interviewed for it. I just kind of kept it and tried to ride out the storm that was happening. afterwards, like just inside myself. At the time, I didn't know that a bunch of the participants had kind of met each other and were talking to each other. I think I did browse the report when it first came out. A couple of years later, I did go in and actually read it. I poked around online a little bit and I realized that people had written articles mentioning me because I'm specifically referred to in that report as 777 and found some disturbing, just irritating, really presumptuous things written about me. So, yeah, I went in with very selfish intentions when I was interviewed for the Grace Report.
I mean, I wouldn't call it selfish at all. I think seeking your own healing is such a difficult thing to do. And it takes a lot of bravery to be able to do that. So I just want to say that because I know how that system can just shame us for being selfish just because we seek something that we might desire, want, or just something that we need. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing that because I know how difficult it can be. I think maybe like three things I want to touch on with like what you had said. So like the first one, when you first went in, you didn't even recognize at that point what happened to you was abuse. And that is one of the powerful things when you're seeking help from professionals. And that's one of the sinister things about Bob Jones circles with the IFB about fundamentalism is the control of information and really words that you have access to. Because if you can control how a situation is framed and the words that you use, you can control that person's reality. And in fundamentalism, the abuse is usually very downplayed. There are words that like downplayed a lot. Oh, he made a mistake, or oh, she did this, she did that, or reframe it to put it on the victim. So you're just gaslit in this world, this situation. And so I'm glad that you were able to find that language and get that validation and to start to release just the abuse and trauma you have been put through. And another thing I wanted to say is just I'm so, so sorry about people writing about you online, just the re-traumatization from your own abuse being talked about you being criticized or people saying negative things, X, Y, and Z. It's just very, I don't understand why people do that. And I'm so sorry that that happened to you.
Yeah, I saw a blog from some Christian man out in California who jumped to conclusions and assumed that my parents had paid for my education and wrote this thing about how I squandered their money and ridiculous things. I mean, I paid for my own education. It's just the ignorance that people decide they understand someone else's life and then have the authority to write about it on the internet. I actually called that man up. I found his ministry and his phone number and I called him. He did take the blog post down. It was probably 2019 when that happened. He did take it down for whatever that's worth.
I'm glad you were able to do that and that he took it down because a lot of these pastors and leaders go unchallenged. So I'm glad that he actually did listen and do that. But something else I wanted to dig into is I know, because of the Grace report and the investigation, you had two meetings with Steve Pettit, who was the former president of Bob Jones University. So if you're comfortable sharing like the purpose of those meetings and what was shared.
Yeah, when I first set up the meeting with Pettit, it was before my abuser was arrested. I contacted them late in 2019. Christmas break had recently started, and I didn't think he would ever be arrested. But I wanted to go in and talk to them because I'd finally had a breakthrough where I really understood what happened to me. I wanted to talk to the people who were responsible for removing me from the school. I wanted to have a conversation with them and talk about the effect their decisions had on my life. I wanted to meet with Berg and Dr. Bob. I was conversing with Randy Page, and he kept telling me that if I wanted to meet with these people, I had to set up meetings separately and have three separate meetings Finally, he just had to tell me that Dr. Berg wasn't going to be meeting with anyone. We set up a meeting with Dr. Bob and Pettit, and I brought my brother and my husband with me. In the first meeting, first of all, I just want to say I got all dressed up like I had to dress when I was a student, and I showed up on campus and was very surprised. I was overdressed. Anyways, it was a bit of a shock, but I wanted them to take me seriously. I didn't want my clothing to get in the way of them hearing what I had to say. So I wanted to try to be respectful of the rules, and I didn't want to put any unnecessary roadblocks in my way. And Pettit acted like he hadn't even reviewed my file and he knew nothing about me. And that was really irritating. This meeting set up for weeks and you didn't even take any time to review my file. He mostly just wanted me to talk. He didn't want to say anything. And I mean, for obvious reasons, he's at the head of an organization and he doesn't want to say anything that would create a liability issue. And then at one point, he left the room and Dr. Bob started talking, which was interesting because he was very different while Pettit was out of the room. He kind of leveled with me a little bit, seemed very apologetic, and told me that he thought my abuser belonged under the jail. Pettit came back and sent me off to talk to their PR team because I had mentioned that Ariel Gilreath was working on a report for the 5-year anniversary of the Grace Report. She was working on an article of some kind. I didn't realize at the time they just really wanted more information from me about what was potentially coming in the newspaper. And so they took us to another room and I sat down with Randy Page and I can't remember her name. I want to say Cheryl, but I could be wrong. And they asked me lots of questions and she knew my file forwards and backwards. She knew everything about me. She started talking about the letter that I had written to my prayer group when I left Bob Jones. So I wrote it, I left it on the bed of one of my roommates, and it wound up being confiscated and put into my file. And she'd read it and she was talking to me about it as if I remembered it word for word, and I didn't. And, talking to me about how it's so clear in my letter, how I was groomed. And, I said, I don't remember exactly everything that's in that letter, but I know I wouldn't have used that word because I didn't know what that word was. And anyway, after a long time of them talking to me and trying to figure out exactly what was going on, we left and they had made some empty promises about making a statement on my behalf, which is what I asked for. Because at that point, when we finally got around to having the meeting, my abuser had just been arrested in Greenville for what happened to me at Bob Jones while at CVA when I was 16 years old. They were talking like they fully intended to make a statement on my behalf. And I followed up several times after that. They got the police reports and like the copies of the warrants. And then they were just dragging their feet. And I showed up there one day and I asked for a copy of my file and I pressured them. They sat down with me again and I pressured them to make the statement on my behalf. And they started accusing me of lying about this article that Ariel was working on and like suggesting that I was making things up to try to put pressure on them to make a statement. And I was upset and I just told them that it has nothing to do with any of that. If you don't act first, then there's literally no point because I wanted you to stand in my corner. And if you're not interested in doing that and all you're interested in is gauging the threat so that then you can decide if it's worth responding to, then you're totally missing the point. And on my way out, like Randy Page came out and handed me a copy of my file, and I asked him if he thought that I was lying, and he told me no, that he fully believes me. Carol is her name. Carol fully believes me. And then later that night, or maybe the next day, he released a statement to the Greenville News on my behalf. But I had to push pretty hard.
And how did you feel after reading that statement of the words that they wrote?
I cried. I I recognize now when I read it that it's not really an apology, but after so long of getting nothing, it was like, I don't know, water after a famine. And I don't know. It could have been different. The things that they've done since then have not been fantastic. I don't know that I believe that they would handle something differently now.
like it says in the statement, but at the time, it meant something to me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I mean, it is valid to have those mixed feelings about it. It is hard when it's like a non-apology. It can feel really invalidating, but then for them to even acknowledge that something happened, that is so validating after they expelled you for what clearly no one communicated to you that this was abuse, that this was wrong. And I'm so sorry for how they treated you then, and then even like when the grace report stuff happened. And I know regarding treatment in that community, of course, was your church's reaction. So how did your church first react when things came to light?
They saw me as equally responsible. It was a little bit weird because they wanted to treat me like a child, but try me as an adult. They communicated through my mother. They talked to my mother as if they were talking to me. So, like, I found out later that they had said things to my mother that I didn't even know were said. They would pass messages through my mother, but then at the same time, they wanted to hold me fully accountable and fully responsible. When I finally made it back, I was kicked out of Bob Jones the Sunday before finals, second semester. And when I finally made it back home that Friday, so the following Saturday, I went into the church to talk to the pastors and a couple of the board members. And by then, they had already believed everything that my abuser was saying. They allowed him to get up in front of the church and confess and say my name from the pulpit. And obviously, he didn't confess to what he'd actually done. He confessed to having an affair that was relatively short, not 5 years long. And so I was the other woman. I was the homewrecker and the whore, and the church did nothing to shield me from that. I went into the church that Saturday morning and I told them the truth. I read them a letter and I blamed myself, to be clear, right from the beginning of my abuse. My abuser was telling me that it was my fault. When I was 16, he told me that I owned a skirt that didn't quite touch my knee, and that's why he did what he did. And I'm not going to get into all of the specifics of the ups and downs and the manipulation of that whole process, but I thought I'd caused this problem. And through my views, he was telling me that if I stopped coming around or if I told people what was happening, then he would destroy the church. He would leave his family and the church, destroy the church. I thought that everybody in the area was going to end up going to hell. When I wrote and read my letter, I was apologizing for not saying anything, apologizing for not telling the truth when people pried. And I mean, obviously, I had very good reasons for doing what I did, but I blamed myself. And so they just jumped on board and blamed me also, instead of explaining to me, wait a minute, this is not your fault. You were 15. And they didn't explain any of that to me. They did call the police that Saturday. I asked them not to because I was afraid of what was going to happen to him and to his family. And they did call, and the police officer came, but they stayed in the room to listen. They didn't give me any privacy and what they heard. Never made them correct the narrative or shield me from any of the upset and the rage. And it didn't change their opinions. It's weird, today talking to some of the people who were on the board then, it's like they weren't even in the room. It's just because I think what they believed to be true about the pastor based on their interactions and what they wanted to believe about him, really even hearing me. It's like everything I said went through some filter before it reached their brains. I was publicly shamed. I had to get up in front of the church and apologize. And then the pastors were lying about me to my mother, telling them, the new senior pastor in particular, telling my mother that I was doing things I wasn't doing. And it just turned into this really terrible situation. And I eventually, within a couple of months, just terminated my membership and I left the church.
Oh, I am so sorry that you were put through all of that. It's just so horrible how you were abused from such a young age, but you are further re-traumatized to this shame and this blame and internalizing that. And them prioritizing this leader, this pastor, over you, and this pastor just putting that pressure on you of you could destroy this church or you could destroy my family. And it's so much. And I'm so sorry that no one helped you in that situation at all. Oh my gosh.
I think that the church's response was definitely more damaging than the abuse itself.
Mm. Oh my gosh. You eventually then did a legal case. And could you talk about how that came about in the process of that?
Yes, I'm going to try to give you a truncated version. I was struggling a lot since talking to the Grace team because I took the lid off and I didn't know how to put it all back. And I mean, I kept it under control, but not very well internally. And things were just getting harder and harder for me as the years were passing. And I was dealing with a lot of depression in 2016, 2017. And then in the beginning of 2019, I had a particularly rough go, and my husband was very concerned about me. I remember he called one of my friends and asked her to talk to me on the phone because I wasn't getting out of bed. And anyway, I started thinking that the best way to handle what was going on in my head was to start writing down what I remembered to try to get all of the thoughts that were bouncing around in my head out of my brain and onto paper. And I thought maybe then I could kind of make sense of them and understand. And that helped a little bit, but I would almost get to a point where I could say, okay, obviously, I mean, look how old you were. That was not your fault. But then the next logical step was that it was his fault. And if it was his fault, I had to recognize things like he did it on purpose. He knew what he was doing. It wasn't a mistake. And I just couldn't go there. I couldn't let myself make him the bad guy because for some reason I was still protecting him. He trained me really well to do that. And so in August of that year, I decided that it would be a good idea to contact him. And surely he would tell me the truth. So I did. I managed to get him on the phone and we talked for a while. And I asked him certain questions, things like, why did you hold my hand on the plane when I was 15 years old coming back from Ukraine? And his response was that he had good intentions. And I asked questions like, why me? And I just wanted to understand why it happened. I think so. For a lot of years, I was chasing that elusive freedom of forgiveness. If you repent, then you have this freedom. So sorry.
No, it's all good. Take your time, whatever time you need.
To figure out what it was that I was missing. Like what did I do that I needed to repent of that would finally free me? And obviously he lied to me the whole way through that conversation. And I got off the phone feeling like really angry because I knew he was lying to me, but also feeling really guilty because how dare I accuse him? That prompted me to go online and try to understand what is abuse really. So I was reading some articles about abuse and trying to figure out if the characteristics of an abuser really matched up with this man. And in the middle of one of these articles, there was an ad for the Child Victims Act that had passed in New York State. And it had just gone into effect. So it was passed in January and went into effect in August, I think.
And what year was this?
This was 2019.
Okay.
And I don't know how to explain. It kind of validated my quest, I guess. It was like they gave me permission to ask questions. Like that was okay. It was that long ago, but it didn't matter. It was okay to ask questions. And I didn't want to file a lawsuit. That's not what I wanted to do. But that realization led me down another path in realizing that I had legal recourse in the criminal court also because South Carolina doesn't have a statute of limitations for these types of crimes, which meant that even though New York State's statute of limitations had passed a long time ago for me, South Carolina was still on the table. And I did call an attorney in
New York because I wanted to understand what that process was like. And I called the police department up in Hyde Park, New York, to find out if they still had my original police report. And they did, they had all of it. And so I had this need, this burning need to just go to New York and get my file because they wouldn't release it to me except in person and speak to the attorney up there just to kind of understand what the process would look like if I went that direction. And my husband had just broken his leg. So he was home finally getting around in the wheelchair, and I left him with all four kids. I went to New York and was leaving the hotel lobby, and I bumped into a man who used to be on the board of Hyde Park Baptist Church when my abuse was exposed. And he's the man who asked me how much my church membership meant to me. And I almost made a beeline for the door, but I decided that maybe this wasn't a coincidence. And I approached him and I asked him if I could ask him a question. And he said, yes, that was fine. And then I asked him if he still thought that the way the church handled my situation was appropriate. And then he said, oh, I thought that was you. Like, I thought I recognized you. And then he said, yes, I do. And until you repent, your life will be miserable. So he said to me, he hasn't seen me in 14 years. But he's sure that my life must be miserable because I'm asking about how the church handled my abuse all those years ago. And he invited me to sit down where he and his wife were having breakfast there in the lobby. And we talked a good bit. He told me that I should thank God that he did move me away from there where people do blame me. And I told him that he is everything that's wrong with the church. And I left in tears. And that was horrible. It was like a time warp. Like no time had passed at all. And we just, I don't know, just transported all the way back to 2005. And there I was being blamed all over again. Anyway, so I was trying to understand things and I reached out to my sister, and I'll be careful about telling her story, but I asked her if she could tell me what he did to make her feel uncomfortable because that's all I knew in 2005. When my abuse came to light, she told me that he made me feel uncomfortable too. And that was the extent of our conversation. And so she wrote me back this whole long list of things that I could have typed about my own life, my own grooming process that I'd never told anyone. And that's when the switch just kind of flipped for me. And I realized that this was his MO. Like, he hadn't made a mistake at all. It was all intentional and planned out, and I was picked and it was targeted and groomed and abused on purpose, and none of it was a mistake. And that just kind of lit a fire in me. And I prepared a timeline of my abuse. I reported him to the police in Greenville using a contact that I'd gotten way back during the Grace report. And then I reached out and I tried to talk to some people at Hyde Park Baptist Church to see if they would be willing to talk to me. And just basically, I was treated like I was a threat still all over again. I approached the new senior pastor who had nothing to do with this, doesn't know me, and he wouldn't talk to me unless my father-in-law was there. And then his response was just, I can't tell you anything. So after trying with no luck to communicate with them, I did file a lawsuit against the church under the Child Victims Act.
And what I filed it in May of 2020, and they were served
because of the pandemic delays.
Okay, got you. I see. And then once that happened, what was the church's treatment of you through that process?
There were several people who were very supportive. He was arrested. It was weird because all of a sudden everybody knew that he was the abuser, and everybody had always thought that he was the abuser. And I know that there were some people who genuinely thought that, but it was just very strange to have all these people who were not in that camp all of a sudden be in that camp because he was arrested. But then as soon as my lawsuit hit the newspaper, everybody just lost their minds. Everybody was so angry, and some people took to Facebook to criticize my decision to do this. And you sue a church. That's really high up there on the list of things you just don't do. The church itself didn't reach out to me or say anything directly negative to me. They did get online and say things about how the church had been supporting me through this and that this was an attack on them, which was weird. I don't know if she was just making that stuff up to say it or if she's being told things that weren't true. But that was hard. I had some phone calls. I had a woman call me and scream at me she's a former member, and I tried to be as gracious and understanding. And then I just asked her some questions back about, because she said, you should be going after the people who knew, not after the church. And the main argument was, it was 20 years ago. And it's true that there are a lot of new people there, and the pastor didn't have anything to do with this. It's not a totally new place with a totally new group of people. But I thought that the new pastor would have been the perfect person to redeem the past, to step in and look objectively and see what was done wrong and try to understand how that affected me, apologize to me, and then they should be doing differently, which really was my only goal from the beginning. I wanted to be heard. I wanted them to understand what they did wrong. And I really thought that when I filed my lawsuit, which was very detailed and full of a lot of information about what actually happened to me, I thought that would give them the information they needed to see how wrong that they had been and then want to talk to me. So I really thought that they would have reached out to my attorney and asked what it would have taken to make it right. And that's as far as the lawsuit was going to go. But that's not what happened at all. They responded in typical fashion, denying everything. They even denied having knowledge sufficient to form a belief as to the truth of whether or not my abuser was ever employed there or had an office on the premises. And then they claimed the doctrine of unclean hands, which was basically blaming me, saying that I'd also made a moral breach and therefore had no claim. So that was devastating to me. I guess I was just really naive going into this, and there's so many people involved who I love and I really wanted to think the best of, and who I thought would want good for me. And just the response to me overall, the response in legal proceedings, the way the new pastor was joking from the pulpit about lawsuits, and just the whole thing was just really devastating to me. And it took a lot for me to reorient myself every time something happened. Even when we got further into the process and I started to just accept the fact that this is the way this is going to go, it's still every time just knocked me off my feet. And when they sued my abuser right before sentencing in the criminal proceeding, which gave him leverage with the solicitor's office, and he got to change his plea from guilty to Alford, which basically is him maintaining his innocence in his guilty plea. And that's their fault. Every time in the last 20 years, they try to protect themselves, and in doing that, they protect him. And then suing him also gave him access to all of my medical records, my therapy records, all my private messaging, every private thing that they could demand, they demanded. And the justice system is brutal.
Oh my God. Like, I'm just so heartbroken by your story, because you trying to seek justice, to be heard, you were just such a brave person to push through and speak the truth and just trying to hold them accountable. But I'm curious, what was the final outcome of your case?
The outcome of the criminal case was that my abuser was sentenced to 10 years that was suspended to 5 years of probation. And for every 20 days he served, he got a full 30 days of credit. When 3 years, that sentence was over. So he's off of probation. For the time that he was on probation, he wasn't allowed any unsupervised contact with minors, except that his probation officer made an exception for his grandchildren. So whatever, that is what it is, and it's over now. And the outcome of the civil case, I was dead set on going to trial because I wanted the truth, and I wanted the truth on public record. And we got within a week of trial, I guess, and the church decided to lie about being bankrupt, because if they file for bankruptcy, whether they are or they are not, it automatically shoves my trial date off the calendar. And once I lose my date on the calendar, even if there were no other roadblocks, it would have been another year to get another date on the calendar. But if they had filed, then I would have had to hire a bankruptcy attorney, which would have cost me anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000
and fight their bankruptcy and then get my trial back on the calendar. I had no idea how long that was going to be, and I couldn't keep doing this for more years. Their attorney admitted to mine that they were not bankrupt and they were only doing this to thwart the trial. So I had to settle. I didn't have any choice but to do that. And rather than start my trial on April 15, I drove up to New York with several of my family members, and I held a press conference on the courthouse steps because I wanted to make sure that my voice was heard, and I didn't want to allow the rumors to get out first. Like, people ahead of the trial, people were already accusing me of not settling because I just wanted more money. I was suing the church because the church had an insurance policy, they said, and I just wanted money. It wasn't about the truth or anything else. It was just because I wanted money. And I'm not trying to downplay survivors suing for money, because survivors have all of the reasons in the world why they need to sue, right? And sometimes that's money because they have to pay for therapy and they need to support themselves, and that's totally valid. That wasn't my reason for suing. And I even had to fight my attorneys during the process because, we found out that what they were offering me was the full limit of the insurance policy. And my attorney told me that he's never had someone turn down the full limits of the insurance policy. And I said, this isn't about money for me. I don't want their money. I'm not going to take money so that I'll shut up and go away. And I wanted depositions, wanted people that have to come and answer hard questions. I felt like I had a right to understand all of the things that led up to and then facilitated my abuse and then the cover up. And my attorney kept telling me, well, you know what the truth is? You know what the truth is. I know what the truth is about what happened to me. But I know a lot now that I didn't know before I started this process. I didn't know all of the pieces, all of the failures that allowed for the implosion of my entire life. So we negotiated a settlement, and obviously I can't talk about that. And I vowed to tell the whole truth publicly. That's why I am doing my podcast that's called Perverted Justice. And I'm going to tell the whole story very slowly with all of the necessary information.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm so sorry that they were not really held accountable. And I'm also sorry for your attorney talking to you like that. It's just a lot of the people in these spaces need to be trauma informed and understand like the effects of abuse, because that's just so invalidating to hear. I again commend you just for doing that press conference and taking your voice back that they've tried to silence for so long. Because, one of the things that is so traumatizing when you experience that harm, that abuse, is there's no one there that witnesses it with you, that has that compassionate heart to help you see the pain and understand what it really is. Trauma happens, or one of the parts that plays into it is we don't have anyone there for us to have that compassion, that understanding, to see us, to hear us, to understand us. And that is part of the healing process, is being heard in whatever format that is that the survivor decides to seek. And oh my gosh, and I'm so proud of you for also being willing to do the podcast. I'll definitely point people to that in the show notes. But oh my gosh. And I know in your story you talked a lot about the clear issues, but were there any points that you had to outline issues in the justice system that prevents survivors from seeking justice?
I think not understanding how the process goes. I think if I could go back to the beginning now, knowing what I know about the system, I would do several things differently, beginning with how I communicate with the people who are doing the investigation. I think there's a lot of things that the people who do this every day just assume that you understand. And so not having a support system, I could not have lasted this legal process if it weren't for my family. I'm number 5 of 10 children, I don't think I said, which is one of the things that made my family a target. But my family's been super supportive through this whole thing. And I didn't realize in 2005, I just shut down, and most of my family knew nothing about what happened to me all these years. And so I started speaking up, and they started learning, and they just got right in the game with me. And several of my sisters were going to bat for me when I couldn't do it online. And they didn't all handle things the way that I would handle them, but sometimes they handled them the way they needed to be handled, and I couldn't have done that myself. So a strong support system is important, but the justice system is brutal no matter how you approach it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'm so glad you had family and siblings that backed you up through that process, believed you, validated you, and wanted you to find healing and to really get justice. And it's horrible, all the abuse that has happened in these different churches and environments. And I know towards the beginning of the interview, you were saying how hearing Tina Anderson's story made you realize you weren't alone. And I think that is the power of survivors speaking up, because shame is a common emotion that is weaponized by these groups to silence victims and to make them blame themselves. But when you start to speak up, advocate for yourself, and take your power back, you realize that shame was never yours to carry. And these churches, these leaders, Bob Jones University, they should be the one to carry that shame, most definitely. And I know a film came out, it's called For Our Daughters, about just all the sexual abuse that has happened in the SBC and other conservative denominations. And I think it is, again, like a testament, like, to you and other survivors who speak up about this, because more people will come forward and continue to come forward. And even with the Grace Report, I think a lot of survivors know that's the tip of the iceberg. So I'm just so amazed by your bravery and coming forward, going through that full legal process, continuing to speak up. I commend you so much for that.
Thank you. I think overall the process has been more healing than harmful, but it's been quite the journey. And I also need to make sure that I also mention that my therapist put up with me for 4 years. She was very patient. She actually is from the Bob Jones world. Obviously, she doesn't agree with all of that at this point. I don't know if she ever did, but she understood it. So I didn't have to explain any of it. And then to your point about blaming yourself and, giving language, my abuse was affecting me in hugely negative ways while I tried to deal with it myself and shove it down and run away from it and all the things. And once I had language for it and I started to understand what actually happened and why it happened, that's the only way that I was able to start healing. And I'm in a much better place now than I was 5 years ago because I finally turned around and faced it. And that made a lot of people unhappy. It was really hard to do because I'm so accustomed to trying to do the right thing, make, keep the peace with all men. That's one of the scripture verses that got posted online when I filed my lawsuit, as if pretending that everything is okay is actually living at peace. So understanding what happened, having language for what happened is not the thing that causes the upset. It's the thing that can start you on a path to healing.
Yes, agree 100%. And you were so right. And I think that's one of the things that I love about doing this podcast is, with Surviving BJU and this one, is starting to give people that language, because, it will resonate with you. It will validate you. And like, once you know what something is, you can then, like you said, start that healing journey. You can know what steps to take and know that you're not alone. But as we're getting to the end of this interview, I want to ask if there was anything else that you would like to share.
I think I've said all I need to say. Thank you so much for having me on.
Of course. Thank you so much for coming on. And I think your story is really going to help a lot of people who have been through a similar situation and are scared and afraid. That's the most powerful thing, is when we speak up, survivors can come together and give each other that support. I'm looking forward to your podcast and its episodes being published. So I'll link that for people who would like to subscribe. But thank you so much for being willing to share your story on the podcast today.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. Have a good night.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond BJU. My Patreon supporters allow me to do this work, and I am so grateful for them. If you could join my Patreon community, it would be greatly appreciated. But if you feel you cannot do that, if you could give the podcast a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, because this helps other listeners just like you discover the show. Thank you.